What if I told you that one of the greatest cities ever built was deliberately erased from history, buried under stone and legend by the very people who feared what it represented? The Aztec capital of Tenochtitlan was home to more than 200,000 people at a time when London had fewer than 60,000. A gleaming island metropolis of aqueducts, floating gardens, and pyramids that stunned even the hardened Spanish soldiers who first laid eyes on it. But within 2 years, it was rubble, and the story of the civilization that built it was rewritten by its conquerors. How did a people dismissed as landless wanderers, refugees begging for scraps of swamp and rock, rise in less than 2 centuries to master an empire of 6 million souls? In this documentary, we'll tear through the myths and the colonial distortions to uncover the full, extraordinary story of the Mexica, a civilization far more sophisticated, far more human, and far more remarkable than anyone wanted you to know. Long before the Aztecs raised their temples above the waters of Lake Texcoco, the land we now call Mexico was already ancient with memory. Civilizations had risen, flourished, and crumbled across Mesoamerica for more than 2,000 years, each one leaving behind a layer of myth, architecture, and ambition upon which the next would build. It began in the tropical lowlands of the Gulf Coast, where the Olmec people carved colossal stone heads from basalt boulders sometime around 1000 BCE. These enigmatic figures, some weighing as much as 40 tons, stared outward across the jungle with an authority that announced something new in the Americas. The Olmec gave Mesoamerica its first complex society, its earliest writing systems, and the ritual ball game that would echo through every civilization that followed them. Then came Teotihuacan, rising in the Valley of Mexico during the first centuries of the Common Era. This extraordinary city grew into one of the largest urban centers on Earth, home to perhaps 100,000 people at its peak. Its Pyramid of the Sun stood nearly 70 meters tall, aligned with precise astronomical intention. Teotihuacan traded, influenced, and intimidated civilizations as distant as the great Maya cities of the Yucatan Peninsula. And then, around 600 CE, it burned. Whether by internal revolt or outside invasion, no one knows for certain. The city was abandoned, its gods left without worshippers, its streets given over to silence and dust. Into that silence stepped the Toltec. From their capital at Tula, located roughly 80 kilometers north of present-day Mexico City, the Toltec Empire built a reputation so formidable that later peoples would invoke their name as a synonym for civilization itself. Their ruler, the priest-king Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent, became a figure of legend whose promised return would one day echo with devastating consequence. At its height, Tula influenced trade networks stretching from northern Mexico to Central America, and the memory of its power outlasted the city itself. But around 1150 CE, Tula fell. Drought, internal strife, and pressure from migrating northern peoples called the Chichimex combined to shatter Toltec dominance. The city was sacked and burned, its population scattered. What followed was fracture. The Valley of Mexico became a contested arena of competing city-states and ethnic groups, each one claiming descent from the Toltec legacy to legitimize their ambitions. The Acolhua settled at Texcoco. The Tepanec built power at Azcapotzalco. Dozens of smaller groups jostled for position around the shores of the Great Lake system. The stage was set. The old powers had gone, their ruins standing as both inspiration and warning. Into this fractured, volatile landscape, a wandering and desperate people would soon arrive, carrying nothing but a prophecy and a hunger that would reshape the entire world they entered. Where did the Mexica come from? They would answer that question with a story so powerful, so carefully cultivated, that it would serve them for centuries as both spiritual foundation and political weapon. In the beginning, they said, there was Aztlan. The name itself means place of reeds or place of herons, and the Mexica described it as an island paradise somewhere to the north, a land of abundance where their ancestors lived in comfort alongside 6 other tribes. Beneath this blessed homeland lay Chicamostoc, the place of 7 caves, a mythic womb from which the original peoples of the world had emerged. These were not merely stories told around fires. They were sacred geography, a map of identity etched into the collective memory of a people who would one day need to explain why they deserved to rule. The departure from Aztlan, the Mexica said, came not from desperation, but from divine command. Their patron god, Huitzilopochtli, the hummingbird of the south, spoke to the tribal priests with unmistakable authority. Leave this place, he commanded. Travel south. Find the sign I will give you, an eagle perched upon a cactus devouring a serpent, and there you will build a city greater than anything the world has seen. The Mexica obeyed. It was during this migration that the name Mexica itself crystallized as an identity. The precise origin of the word remains debated among scholars, some linking it to a founding leader named Mexitli, others connecting it to an ancient name for Huitzilopochtli himself. Whatever its root, the name marked a deliberate separation from the other tribes left behind in Aztlan. These people were no longer simply one group among many. They were the chosen of Huitzilopochtli, singular in purpose, bound by covenant to a destination only their god could see. The migration southward through the arid landscapes of northern Mexico lasted not years but generations. Archaeological and historical evidence suggests the Mexica were moving through this region during the 1100s and 1200s CE, a period of extraordinary difficulty. They camped, planted, harvested, and moved again, carrying their god's image in a sacred bundle that the priestly class tended with absolute devotion. Huitzilopochtli spoke through his priests at each stopping point, directing the path, forbidding certain alliances, demanding ritual obedience. The god was not a distant concept. He was a traveling companion, intimate and demanding. Along the way, the Mexica absorbed hardship into identity. Every obstacle became evidence of divine purpose. Every defeat or rejection by more established peoples, and there were many, reinforced the narrative that their greatness was deferred, not denied. This is the extraordinary psychological alchemy the migration story performed. Suffering became proof of destiny. This was not accidental. The priests and leaders who shaped the oral tradition understood precisely what they were building. A people who believe they are chosen endure what others cannot. And when those same people eventually gained power, the origin myth transformed from a source of comfort into an instrument of legitimacy. The Mexica did not simply arrive in the Valley of Mexico as refugees and wanderers. According to the story they told, they arrived as the fulfillment of a prophecy centuries in the making. The journey from Aztlan was real in the ways that mattered most. Whether or not the Paradise Island ever existed, the migration reshaped a disparate tribal people into a coherent nation with a shared purpose and a god who expected greatness from them. They would need every bit of that conviction. Because when the Mexica finally descended into the crowded, competitive world of the Valley of Mexico, they arrived last, with nothing, and were welcomed by almost no one. They arrived with nothing but their God and their conviction, and the Valley of Mexico had no patience for either. By approximately 1250 CE, the Mexica had descended into one of the most densely contested regions in all of Mesoamerica. The Valley of Mexico was not empty frontier waiting for settlers. It was a sophisticated, crowded political landscape where power had already been divided, negotiated, and defended for generations. City-states lined the shores of the Great Lake system at the valley's heart, each one established, proud, and deeply suspicious of newcomers. The powers that mattered were formidable. Culhuacan, in the south, traced its lineage directly to the legendary Toltec civilization, giving it a cultural prestige that other valley peoples openly envied. Azcapotzalco, on the western lakeshore, was building the commercial and military strength that would soon make it the valley's dominant force. Texcoco held sway in the east, cultivating a reputation for learning and refinement that would only deepen over the following century. These were not simple chiefdoms. They were organized states with bureaucracies, armies, and long institutional memories. Into this world walked the Mexica, and the established powers took one look at them and reached an immediate verdict: barbarians. The label carried genuine weight. The valley's ruling classes used the word chichimec to describe peoples from the northern frontier, a term that implied rough, nomadic, uncivilized origins. It was not entirely inaccurate as a description of the Mexica's recent past, and the valley's elites deployed it with aristocratic contempt. The Mexica had no noble pedigree, no illustrious ancestors recognizable to the valley's political culture, and no land to call their own. In a world where legitimacy flowed from lineage and territory, they possessed neither. The consequences were immediate and repeated. Every time the Mexica attempted to settle in a promising location, established neighbors drove them out. They moved from Chapultepec, the hill of grasshoppers on the western shore, after a coalition of valley city-states attacked and routed them around 1299 CE. Their leader was captured and sacrificed. Their people were scattered. They were a community in chronic displacement, unwanted guests in a landscape with no room for them. And yet they survived. How? Partly through the mercenaries' trade. The Mexica had one commodity that the valley's city-states would grudgingly accept: their soldiers. Generations of hardship migration had produced fighters who were disciplined, aggressive, and motivated in ways that comfortable urban armies sometimes were not. Culhuacan, the Toltec lineage city that regarded the Mexica with particular disdain, nonetheless hired them as warriors and settled them in Tizapan, a barren, snake-infested stretch of land apparently chosen in the hope that the environment would finish what expulsion had started. The Mexica ate the snakes and endured. This period of humiliation was doing something invisible but essential. Every expulsion confirmed the necessity of finding permanent ground. Every mercenary contract taught the Mexica how valley politics actually functioned, who held power, who owed favors, how alliances formed and fractured. They were learning the system they intended to one day master, from the very bottom of it. They were absorbing, too, the one thing they desperately needed but could not yet claim: legitimacy. Service to Culhuacan, however degrading, put the Mexica in proximity to Toltec cultural prestige. They watched, listened, and waited. The valley's established powers had made a calculation they would spend the next century regretting. They had decided the Mexica were useful but unthreatening, degraded enough to employ and too weak to fear. That miscalculation would cost them everything. But first, the Mexica would need to engineer one of the most audacious social maneuvers in Mesoamerican history, a bid for legitimacy through blood and marriage that would change their standing forever. The arrangement with Culhuacan had given the Mexica proximity to greatness. Now they would reach for it and nearly destroy themselves in the attempt. By the close of the 13th century, the Mexica had proven their value as soldiers often enough that something remarkable became possible. A marriage alliance. The Mexica approached the Culhua king and made a request that carried enormous symbolic weight. They asked for one of his daughters to be given to them as a noble bride, a living connection to the Toltec bloodline they so desperately needed to claim. The king agreed. What he could not have anticipated was what the Mexica intended to do with her. Their god Huitzilopochtli, they believed, had spoken. The princess would not be a bride. She would be something far more sacred. She would be a deity incarnate, transformed through sacrifice into a living vessel of divine power. To the Mexica, this was the highest possible honor. They flayed her body and dressed a priest in her skin, then invited her father to attend the ceremony they described only as a great religious celebration. The Culhua king arrived bearing offerings. He entered the darkened temple, and in the flickering torchlight, he saw a priest wearing his daughter's skin. What happened next moved with terrible speed. The king's horror turned instantly to fury, and that fury spread through Culhuacan like fire through dry grass. The Mexica had not offered an honor. They had committed an atrocity. Every soldier, every neighbor, every city-state watching the valley's politics understood the response that was required. The Mexica were driven out with absolute violence, chased from Tizapan into the one place no one else wanted: the marshes. Around 1323, they retreated into the shallow, reed-choked wetlands of Lake Texcoco, standing in water and mud, surrounded by enemies on every shore. By almost any measure, they had reached the lowest point in their long history of low points. Stateless, reviled, expelled even from the degraded margins where they had scraped out an existence. But something had shifted in how the Mexica understood themselves. The Culhuacan incident, catastrophic as it was, had clarified their identity in ways that decades of wandering had not. They were not failed aspirants to someone else's civilization. They were a chosen people, set apart by their gods' impossible demands, destined for a greatness that ordinary political maneuvering could never deliver. Their very outcast status became sacred proof of their special destiny. From the swamps, they looked back at the shores they had been denied and saw not permanent defeat but preparation. Every humiliation, every expulsion, every snake eaten in Tizapan had been leading somewhere. They were about to find a sign in those waters, an eagle on a cactus, a place their god had promised them since they left Aztlan. The city they were about to build would one day make the valley's proud city-states look like footnotes. The sign, when it finally came, was unmistakable. Somewhere in the shallow reed beds of Lake Texcoco in the year 1325, a Mexica scout or priest, accounts differ, looked out across the brackish water and saw it. An eagle, wings spread wide, perched atop a nopal cactus growing from a rocky outcrop, a serpent writhing in its talons. The image was exactly what Huitzilopochtli had promised them since they departed Aztlan, a divine marker, a cosmic arrow pointing down at a precise patch of earth and declaring, "Here." This is the place. For a people who had wandered for generations, who had eaten snakes in volcanic wastelands and watched their princess sacrificed in a ceremony that made them enemies of everyone around them, the sight must have carried an almost unbearable weight of relief. They had found their home. The island was not impressive by any conventional measure. It sat in the middle of a lake surrounded by hostile city-states, its ground soft and unstable, its resources minimal. And ordinary people might have looked at it and seen a liability. The Mexica looked at it and saw a fortress. Construction began immediately, and it began with the sacred before it addressed the practical. The first structure was a modest temple to Huitzilopochtli, little more than reeds and mud brick at the outset, planted at what would become the ceremonial heart of the city. The center would always belong to the god who had led them here. Everything else would radiate outward from that divine nucleus. But Tenochtitlan could not survive on faith alone, and Mexica understood engineering as well as they understood theology. The island's greatest challenge was also its greatest opportunity: water. The same lake that isolated them from enemies also threatened to swallow the city entirely. Their solution was the Chinampa, long rectangular plots of land built up from lake sediment and anchored by willow roots, essentially floating gardens that could be extended outward across the shallows in almost any direction. These agricultural platforms were extraordinarily productive, capable of yielding multiple harvests per year in the warm Mesoamerican climate, and they allowed the Mexica to literally manufacture new land as the population grew. Causeways followed. Long raised roads connecting the island to the lakeshore, wide enough for foot traffic and the movement of goods, narrow enough to be defended by small numbers against any force attempting to cross. The lake, once a barrier to survival, had been redesigned into a defensive moat stretching in every direction. Not long after Tenochtitlan's founding, a second settlement took root on a neighboring island to the north. Tlatelolco, founded around 1337 by a separate faction of the Mexica, would grow into Tenochtitlan's twin city and its great commercial center. For generations, the two settlements existed in tension with each other, rival communities sharing a lake but competing for dominance. The relationship would eventually resolve itself in Tenochtitlan's favor, but for now, two Mexica cities faced the world together from their watery platform, small and overlooked by the powerful polities watching from the shores. Those polities had reason to feel comfortable ignoring them. Tenochtitlan in 1325 was a settlement of perhaps a few hundred people, poor in resources, politically subordinate, militarily negligible. The Tepanec Empire of Azcapotzalco controlled the western shore and soon extracted tribute from the island city. The Mexica paid it. They were, once again, servants to a greater power. But there is something worth remembering about the geography of what had been built. Every great empire in human history begins somewhere. Rome began as a cluster of mud huts on a hill above a river. The island of Tenochtitlan, unremarkable and waterlogged, surrounded by enemies who could not imagine it as a threat, had one advantage that no army and no tribute payment could ever provide. It was theirs. And from that foundation, something extraordinary was about to grow. The Mexica had their city. Now they needed power to match their ambitions, and they would find their path to it through an alliance that would reshape the entire valley. To live under someone else's heel is to learn patience. The Mexica, newly settled on their island, had little choice but to learn it well. The power that cast its shadow over Lake Texcoco in the mid-14th century was Azcapotzalco, capital of the Tepanec Empire and home to one of the most formidable rulers in Mesoamerican history. His name was Tezozomox, and he would reign for an almost incomprehensible span of time, holding power from roughly 1360 until 1426. Patient, calculating, and utterly ruthless, Tezozomox built the Tepanec Empire into the dominant force of the valley through a combination of military conquest, strategic marriage, and the careful humiliation of rivals. He was the kind of ruler who understood that control does not always require armies. Sometimes tribute will do the job just as well. The Mexica paid theirs in labor and loyalty. As vassals of Azcapotzalco, they were required to deliver goods to their overlords at regular intervals, fish and agricultural produce from their chinampas, manufactured items, whatever the Tepanecs demanded. Refusal was not an option for a small island community surrounded by a hostile lake and a more hostile political landscape. So the Mexica paid, and they watched, and they waited. But vassalage carried an unexpected benefit. Tezozomox needed soldiers. His ambitions across the valley required constant military campaigns, and the Mexica, already developing a reputation for ferocity in battle, made excellent mercenaries. They were deployed against Tepanec enemies throughout the region, fighting wars that enriched Azcapotzalco while simultaneously giving the Mexica warriors something far more valuable than plunder. It gave them experience. Battle after battle, campaign after campaign, the Mexica military machine was being sharpened on someone else's grinding stone. Tenochtitlan itself was growing. The Chinampa system expanded steadily outward into the lake, creating new land and supporting a rising population. More people meant more warriors. More warriors meant more leverage, even if that leverage could not yet be openly exercised. The island that had held a few hundred souls at its founding was becoming something harder to ignore. The Mexica also understood that military strength alone would never be enough. In Mesoamerica, legitimacy mattered enormously. Bloodlines mattered. A people without royal ancestry were, in the eyes of the established city-states, simply ambitious barbarians. The Mexica needed noble blood to govern them, and they set about acquiring it through the oldest political tool available: marriage. The Culwa, heirs to the prestigious Toltec tradition and keepers of genuine royal lineage, had long been neighbors and occasional overlords to the Mexica. Despite the tensions of earlier generations, the two peoples maintained contact, and the Mexica worked carefully to weave themselves into the Culwa nobility through strategic unions. These marriages were investments in credibility, quiet purchases of the genealogical respectability that raw power could never fully provide. The return on that investment arrived around 1375 with a decisive moment in Mexica history. The people of Tenochtitlan selected their first Tlatoani, their first official ruler. His name was Acamapicli, and his credentials were impeccable. Born of a Mexica father and a Culwa noblewoman, he carried within his bloodline a connection to Toltec royalty that transformed the Mexica from a wandering tribe into something that could reasonably claim the status of a civilized people deserving of a throne. Acamapicli's installation did not immediately free the Mexica from Tepanec domination. Tribute continued to flow to Azcapotzalco. But something had fundamentally changed. The Mexica now had a ruler, a dynasty, and a legitimacy they had never possessed before. A people with a king could become a people with a kingdom. The yoke of Azcapotzalco still pressed down, but beneath it, something was quietly coiling. Achaemenopekli ruled for 20 years, and they were years of quiet, deliberate construction. He took multiple wives, as was expected of a Tlatoani, and the children he fathered with noble women from across the valley seeded Mexica royal blood into the next generation. This was dynasty building in its most literal form. By the time he died in 1395, the office of Tlatoani had been transformed from an experiment into an institution. His son Huitzilihuitl inherited the throne and proved himself a gifted political operator. Where Achaemenopekli had focused on establishing the bloodline, Huitzilihuitl understood that bloodlines needed allies to survive. He arranged marriages with extraordinary care, securing a union with the daughter of none other than Tezozomoc himself. The benefits were immediate and tangible. The crushing tribute burden on Tenochtitlan was significantly reduced. Cotton arrived from the warmer lowlands as a trade benefit, allowing the Mexica to weave garments they had previously been unable to produce. A marriage had accomplished what armies could not yet attempt. Huitzilihuitl also expanded Mexica territory through military campaigns, carefully prosecuted always within the boundaries that Tepanec overlordship permitted. He died in 1417, leaving behind a city larger, wealthier, and more confident than the one he had inherited. His successor was Chimalpopoca, still young when he took power and blessed with perhaps the most advantageous connection a Mexica ruler could possess. He was Tezozomoc's own grandson. The old Tepanec ruler doted on him. Under this protection, Tenochtitlan flourished, receiving favorable treatment from Azcapotzalco that would have been unimaginable a generation earlier. The Mexica were granted permissions to build a great causeway and an aqueduct, infrastructure that transformed daily life on the island and signaled to every observer in the valley that these former barbarians now enjoyed genuine imperial favor. Then, in 1426, Tezozomoc died. He had reigned for more than 6 decades. His iron will had held the Tepanec Empire together through sheer force of personality. And the moment he was gone, that empire began to fracture. The succession fell to his son Maxtla, a man cut from very different cloth. Suspicious, aggressive, and deeply resentful of the privileges Tenochtitlan had accumulated, Maxtla moved quickly to reassert dominance over the valley's subject peoples. Chimalpopoca, accustomed to the warmth of his grandfather's favor, suddenly found himself facing a ruler who viewed him as a threat rather than a cherished relative. The political ground had shifted overnight. Maxtla had Chimalpopoca seized, and the young Tlatoani died in captivity in 1426, his exact fate a matter of some historical debate, but his removal from power absolute. Tenochtitlan was now leaderless, its patron dead, and a hostile tyrant seated at Azcapotzalco. It was the gravest crisis the Mexica had faced since their arrival on the island. But crises, as they had already learned through decades of patient vassalage, had a way of creating opportunities. The man who would seize this one was already waiting. His name was Itzcoatl. Obsidian serpent, his name meant in Nahuatl, and the title would prove fitting. He was the 4th son of Achaemenopekli, born not to a noble wife but to a humble woman, a vegetable seller according to some accounts. That origin, so far beneath the dignity of royal blood, might have disqualified him entirely in another era. Instead, it seemed to forge in him something harder than privilege could produce. When the Mexica Council of Elders chose Itzcoatl as their new Tlatoani in 1427, they were not simply filling a vacancy. They were making a bet. The city was ringed by enemies, stripped of its protector, and grinding under a tribute burden that Maxtla had swiftly intensified to remind Tenochtitlan of its place. Some among the Mexica counseled submission. They had survived before through patience and accommodation. Perhaps they could survive again. What followed was one of the most consequential decisions in Mesoamerican history. Standing before his uncertain people, Itzcoatl did not promise safety. He promised war. And beside him stood the man whose strategic mind would make that war winnable, Tlacaelel, his nephew and newly appointed chief advisor. Tlacaelel was, by any measure, a political genius. He understood that the Mexica did not simply need military victory. They needed a revolution in how they understood themselves and their place in the cosmos. He would provide both. The first move was diplomatic. Itzcoatl and Tlacaelel reached out to Nezahualcoyotl, the exiled ruler of Texcoco whose kingdom had also fallen under Tepanec domination. Nezahualcoyotl harbored his own grievances, his own hunger for restoration. The second ally was Tlacopan, a smaller Tepanec city on the western shore of the lake that had grown quietly resentful of Azcapotzalco's dominance. Together, these three cities formed what history would come to call the Triple Alliance, struck in 1428 with a single purpose: to break Tepanec power forever. Maxtla, it appears, did not take the threat seriously enough. That miscalculation cost him everything. The war was brutal and relatively swift. Mexica and allied warriors laid siege to Azcapotzalco, cutting it off from supply and reinforcement. The fighting was intense, the city's defenders determined, but the momentum of the alliance proved overwhelming. By the end of 1428, Azcapotzalco had fallen. The great Tepanec capital, which had dominated the Valley of Mexico for decades, was burned and its population scattered. Maxtla fled and was either captured and ritually sacrificed, as Mexica accounts triumphantly claim, or simply vanished into obscurity. The historical record blurs at the edges here. The outcome does not. The overlords were gone. The division of spoils was carefully arranged. Texcoco and Tlacopan each received shares of territory and tribute. But Tenochtitlan, which had supplied the war's most ferocious energy, claimed the greatest portion. In a single campaign season, the Mexica had gone from vassals to the dominant partner of a new and rising power structure. Then came Tlacaelel's most audacious act, and perhaps his most enduring. He ordered the burning of the old codices, the painted books that contained Mexica history as it had been recorded. The official reason offered was that those histories were shameful, filled with the story of a wandering, subject people who had served others and suffered for it. A great empire could not be built on memories of humiliation. What replaced those burned pages was a new history, one in which the Mexica had always been destined for greatness, chosen by Huitzilopochtli, shaped by divine will for dominion over the earth. Was it propaganda? Certainly. Was it also something more? The rewriting of history transformed how an entire people understood their purpose, their suffering, and their victories. Every sacrifice, every indignity endured during the years of vassal. The Triple Alliance, formally consolidated around 1428 to 1430, was not simply a military arrangement. It was a new theory of power, a framework so elegant in its design that it would govern the Valley of Mexico for nearly a century. The terms were precise. Tenochtitlan and Texcoco stood as equal senior partners, each receiving 2/5 of all tribute extracted from conquered territories. Tlacopan, the junior member, received the remaining 1/5, a reflection of its smaller contribution to the Tepanec War and its more modest military capacity. On paper, the alliance looked symmetrical between its two leading cities. In practice, it was already tilting. Tenochtitlan's warriors had fought with a ferocity that Texcoco's king, Nezahualcoyotl, was shrewd enough to recognize. The island city on the lake was hungry in a way that a restored Texcoco, satisfied with reclaiming what it had lost, simply was not. The redistribution of former Tepanec lands reshaped the entire valley. Territories that Azcapotzalco had controlled for generations were parceled out to the alliance's noble families and warrior classes. This moment was critical not just economically but socially. Itzcoatl seized the opportunity to reshape Mexica society from within. Before the Tepanec War, Tenochtitlan had been governed by a relatively fluid social hierarchy. Birth mattered, but the categories were not yet rigid. Itzcoatl changed that. Through a series of domestic reforms enacted in the years following the victory, he formalized a warrior aristocracy, a class of nobles whose status was tied explicitly to military achievement and royal favor. Land grants, called kalpixki, flowed to those who had proven themselves in battle or in service to the state. Those without such credentials found themselves fixed in the lower orders of a newly stratified society. The message was unmistakable. In the new Tenochtitlan, your worth was measured by what you were willing to fight for. Alongside these structural changes came Tlacaelel's most consequential ideological work. The burning of the old codices, which had already begun in the final days of the Tepanec conflict, was only the opening act. What Tlacaelel constructed in its place was a complete cosmological vision centered on one figure above all others: Huitzilopochtli, the Mexica god of sun and war. Earlier Mexica religion had been genuinely pluralistic. The Mexica had absorbed and shared deities freely with their neighbors, as Mesoamerican peoples commonly did. Huitzilopochtli had always been present, but he occupied no throne above the rest. Tlacaelel changed the architecture entirely. In his reimagined cosmos, Huitzilopochtli was not merely a god among gods. He was the sun itself, locked in eternal struggle against the forces of darkness, and he required human blood to complete each daily journey across the sky. Without sacrifice, the sun would falter. Without the Mexica to provide that sacrifice, the world would end. The implications were staggering. Every war the Mexica fought was now a sacred duty. Every captive taken to the temple was a gift that kept the universe alive. Conquest was not ambition. It was obligation. The Mexica were not building an empire for wealth or glory. They were sustaining existence itself. It was a story of breathtaking audacity, and it worked. Within a generation, Mexica warriors would march into battle believing that the fate of the cosmos rode with them. By the time Itzcoatl died around 1440, he left behind a city transformed. The wandering tribe, the humble vassals, the people who had once been told they would never amount to anything, now stood at the center of a new order. But the alliance they had built was hungry, and the Valley of Mexico was only the beginning of what it intended to consume. Itzcoatl left his successors an empire primed for expansion. The man who stepped into that inheritance in 1440 was Moctezuma Ilhuacamina, whose name translated roughly as "he who shoots arrows at the sky." It was an apt description of his ambitions. Moctezuma I was not simply a warrior chief elevated by conquest. He was a statesman who understood that an empire requires more than victories. It requires systems. In the years following his accession, he turned the machinery of Aztec power outward with a precision his predecessors had only begun to develop. His early campaigns pushed in directions that surprised his neighbors. While the Valley of Mexico remained the heartland, Moctezuma's armies drove east and north toward the Huastec region along the Gulf Coast, a culturally distinct people who had long resisted central Mexican dominance. The fighting was fierce, the terrain unfamiliar. But the Huastec campaigns delivered something invaluable beyond territory: access to lowland resources, tropical goods, and new tributaries feeding wealth back into Tenochtitlan's growing coffers. Expeditions south into Oaxaca followed, where the Mixtec and Zapotec peoples found themselves drawn, sometimes violently, into the expanding tribute network. Then came the catastrophe that no army could fight. Between 1450 and 1454, a series of devastating frosts destroyed harvests across central Mexico for 4 consecutive years. The Great Famine, remembered in Aztec records as one rabbit, after the calendar year of its beginning, killed thousands and reduced survivors to desperate measures. Some families sold themselves into slavery simply to eat. The markets of Tenochtitlan, usually overflowing, fell silent. Moctezuma reportedly opened the imperial storehouses for as long as they held, but the crisis exceeded any stockpile. The famine reshaped Aztec thinking in ways that outlasted the hunger itself. The connection between agricultural survival and divine favor had always been present in Mexican cosmology. Now it felt visceral, urgent, undeniable. If the sun demanded blood and the empire had faltered in its obligations, here was the consequence. The ideological framework Tlacaelel had constructed found a new urgency in those empty years. Sacrifice was not merely duty. It was insurance. This climate, equal parts spiritual anxiety and political calculation, gave rise to one of the most unusual institutions in military history. The flower wars, called Xochitlcoatl in Nahuatl, were arranged conflicts fought not primarily to annihilate an enemy but to capture warriors alive for sacrifice. The primary adversaries were the people of Tlaxcala, Huexotzinco, and Cholula, independent states that the Aztecs had not fully conquered and perhaps strategically chose not to. These wars followed understood conventions. They were scheduled. They were brutal. And they served a dual purpose that only the Aztec state could have conceived. They supplied captives for the temples while simultaneously keeping the warrior class sharp, tested, and bound to the sacrificial logic at the empire's core. Meanwhile, Tenochtitlan itself was being remade in stone. Moctezuma oversaw a massive expansion of the Templo Mayor, the great double pyramid at the city's heart dedicated to Huitzilopochtli and the rain god Tlaloc. Aqueducts brought fresh water from the mainland. Causeways were reinforced. The physical city was becoming a monument to permanence, a declaration that the Mexica had not merely arrived but intended to endure. When Moctezuma Ilhuicamina died in 1469, he left behind a state transformed in scale and self-understanding. The empire now stretched from the central valleys to the Gulf Coast and deep into southern Mexico. The tributaries were many. The temples were full. But the man who would inherit this machinery was a different kind of ruler entirely, and under his hand, the Aztec Empire would reach heights that even Moctezuma had not imagined. What did it mean to stand at the center of the world? For the Aztecs, the answer was not philosophical. It was architectural. It was visible. By the 1450s and 1460s, Tenochtitlan had grown into something that defied easy description. A living city of over 200,000 inhabitants rising from the waters of Lake Texcoco like a fever dream made real. Consider the scale. London at the same moment held perhaps 60,000 souls. Paris was comparable. Even Rome, the memory of empire still haunting its ruins, could not match what the Mexica had built on an island in a highland lake. Tenochtitlan was among the largest cities on Earth, and it announced that fact with everything it possessed. The miracle began in the water itself. The Chinampa system, those famous floating gardens anchored to the lake bed with willow roots and built up from layers of mud and vegetation, transformed shallow waters into some of the most productive agricultural land ever cultivated. Farmers worked narrow plots between canals, harvesting multiple crops each year in a cycle that never paused. Maize, squash, chili peppers, tomatoes, and flowers grew in abundance, feeding a metropolis that the surrounding land alone could never have sustained. The Chinampas were not simply farms. They were an act of collective will against geography, a refusal to let the limits of the natural world constrain what the Mexica intended to become. Getting that food and the people and the tribute of an empire into and out of an island city required engineering of a different kind. 3 great causeways connected Tenochtitlan to the mainland, running north toward Tepanec, south toward Iztapalapa, and west toward Tlacopan. Wide enough for 10 people to walk abreast, these raised roads crossed the open lake on foundations of stone and earth, with wooden drawbridges that could be raised to isolate the city in moments. The Aztecs understood that their island was both fortress and capital, and they designed accordingly. Fresh water presented a separate challenge entirely. Lake Texcoco was brackish, unsuitable for drinking. The solution was a pair of aqueducts running from the springs of Chapultepec on the mainland, delivering clean water through twin pipes so that one could be repaired while the other kept flowing. Equally remarkable was the great dike built under the guidance of the poet king Nezahualcoyotl of Texcoco, a structure nearly 10 miles long that separated the brackish eastern waters of the lake from the fresher western zone around the city, protecting Tenochtitlan from flooding and regulating the very waters it lived upon. At the city's heart stood the sacred precinct, a walled compound some 400 meters across containing more than 70 structures. Dominating everything was the Templo Mayor, the great double pyramid whose twin staircases climbed toward shrines dedicated to Huitzilopochtli and Tlaloc, the gods of war and rain. From its summit, priests could see the entire valley. Supplicants climbing those steep steps could see nothing but sky. The effect was deliberate. The architecture of the sacred precinct was designed to overwhelm, to make the individual feel the weight of cosmic obligation pressing down from above. And then there was Tlatelolco. The twin city just north of Tenochtitlan hosted a marketplace that stopped every visitor who ever recorded their impressions cold. On any given day, 60,000 people moved through its ordered sections, buying and selling with a sophistication that rivaled any trading center in the contemporary world. Goods arrived from every corner of the empire: jade from the south, obsidian from the highlands, cacao from the lowlands, cotton mantles, featherwork, gold, slaves, medicines, and food of every description. Dedicated judges walked the market resolving disputes. Standardized measures governed transactions. There was nothing improvised about it. The great market of Tlatelolco was the economic engine of an empire, humming with the organized energy of a civilization at its peak. This was the city that awaited the wider world, a jewel in the water, confident in its permanence, certain of its gods, and entirely unprepared for what was already moving toward it from the east. What held all of this together? What gave the markets their rhythm, the pyramids their purpose, the warriors their cause? The answer lay not in politics or economics, but in something older and more urgent. The Aztecs believed the universe was fragile, that it had already died 4 times, and that they alone stood between humanity and a 5th extinction. Their cosmology described a sequence of ages, each called a sun, each sustained by a different god and destroyed by a different catastrophe. The first sun perished in darkness, devoured by jaguars. The second fell to wind. The third rained fire. The fourth drowned. The world the Aztecs inhabited, the 5th sun, had been purchased at a specific moment in mythological time at the sacred city of Teotihuacan, where the gods had sacrificed themselves to set the sun and moon in motion. Creation was not a gift. It was a debt, and debts required repayment. That repayment was blood. The Aztec pantheon was vast and interlocking. Huitzilopochtli, the hummingbird of the south, was the sun god and the patron of the Mexica people, born each dawn and battling darkness until the next sunrise. Tlaloc, ancient and rain-bringing, demanded his own tribute, particularly from children whose tears were said to call the rains. Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent, governed wind, wisdom, and the cycles of Venus, a deity so complex that different peoples across Mesoamerica had claimed him for centuries. These were not distant deities. They were neighbors, demanding and present, whose moods shaped harvests and wars alike. The ritual calendar organized this relationship with extraordinary precision. The Aztec year held 18 months of 20 days each, plus 5 dangerous unnamed days at the year's end. Each of the 18 months carried its own festival, its own deity, its own prescribed ceremonies. Some months honored the rains with offerings of flowers. Others marked the harvest. Still others demanded the most solemn sacrifices when captive warriors climbed the steep steps of the Templo Mayor for the last time. The scale of sacrifice remains one of history's most debated questions. Spanish accounts, written by men with profound political and religious motivations to condemn what they had destroyed, described tens of thousands killed in single ceremonies. Modern scholars approach these figures with skepticism. Archaeological evidence from excavations at the Templo Mayor confirms sacrifice was real and systematic, with skeletal remains and offering caches providing undeniable proof. But the most extreme Spanish numbers almost certainly reflect deliberate exaggeration, a rhetorical tool used to justify conquest before the fact. What is clear is that sacrifice was state policy as much as theology, and one man above all others had engineered that fusion. Tlacaelel, the great advisor who shaped Aztec ideology through the mid-1400s, understood that a civilization sustained by captive warriors needed an inexhaustible appetite for war. He reframed Aztec sacrifice not merely as religious obligation, but as cosmic emergency, casting the Mexica as the chosen people responsible for preventing universal destruction. The so-called Flowery Wars, staged conflicts with neighboring states designed specifically to generate a steady supply of captives, were his instrument. Enemies were not simply defeated. They were harvested. This made Aztec expansion feel inevitable to the Mexica themselves, divinely mandated and cosmically necessary. It also made them uniquely terrifying to the peoples living on their borders, peoples who watched neighbors taken and not returned, who knew what the drums on the pyramid summit meant. That fear would prove consequential in ways Tlacaelel could never have anticipated. The gods of the fifth sun had given the Aztecs purpose and power. They had also given them enemies who would one day be very easy to recruit. Not every great civilization builds its legacy on the battlefield. Some build it in libraries, courtrooms, and gardens. In the same decades that Tenochtitlan was perfecting the machinery of war and sacrifice, a different kind of greatness was taking shape on the eastern shore of Lake Texcoco in a city that would become the intellectual conscience of the entire Triple Alliance. His name was Nezahualcoyotl. It meant fasting coyote. And his story began not in triumph but in terror. Born in 1402, he was the son of the Texcocan king Ixtlilxochitl. When Nezahualcoyotl was just 16, the Tepanec warlord Tezozomoc launched a devastating campaign against Texcoco. The young prince hid in a tree and watched his father be killed directly below him. For the next 2 decades, he lived as a fugitive prince, sheltered by allies, hunted by enemies, surviving through wit rather than force. When the political tide shifted and the Tepanec Empire collapsed after Tezozomoc's death, Nezahualcoyotl allied with the rising Mexica of Tenochtitlan and reclaimed his throne in 1431. What he built afterward was extraordinary. He codified Texcocan law into 80 distinct statutes, organizing courts by category with separate tribunals for criminal cases, land disputes, and military matters. Judges were forbidden from accepting gifts. Even the king himself could be subject to review. For a world often described purely through the lens of conquest and sacrifice, this was governance of remarkable sophistication. His engineering ambitions matched his legal ones. When flooding threatened the cities of the lake basin, it was Nezahualcoyotl who designed and built the Great Dike, a structure stretching nearly 10 miles across the lake, separating the saltwater of Lake Texcoco from the freshwater channels closer to Tenochtitlan. This single project protected millions of people and anchored the agricultural productivity of the entire valley for generations. But it is his poetry that reaches across 5 centuries most directly. Nezahualcoyotl wrote in Nahuatl with a philosophical restlessness that set him apart from his time. He questioned the plurality of gods, searching instead for a singular, invisible divine force he called Tlocnahuaque, the Lord of the close and near, a deity with no temple and no idol, known only through contemplation. These were not the thoughts of a man satisfied with inherited answers. "Is it true that one lives on earth?" he wrote. "Not forever on earth, only a little while here." The partnership between Texcoco and Tenochtitlan gave the Triple Alliance something it could not have manufactured alone, a cultural depth that matched its military reach. Nezahualcoyotl died in 1472, leaving behind a city of poets, jurists, and engineers. The Aztec world was never simply the world of the warrior and the sacrificial knife. It was also this, a fasting coyote who survived exile and built something beautiful from the ruins of loss. What did it actually mean to be conquered by the Aztecs? Not in the dramatic sense of battle and blood, but in the grinding, daily reality of life after the warriors had gone home. The answer lay not in territorial occupation, but in paperwork. Aztec administrators carried detailed tribute records, codices painted on bark paper and deer hide, listing exactly what each conquered province owed its masters in Tenochtitlan. Not approximations. Exact figures. The Codex Mendoza, compiled shortly after the Spanish conquest, reveals the staggering precision of this system. One coastal province might owe 400 bales of cotton cloth every 80 days. Another delivered 40 bags of cacao beans twice yearly. Tropical regions sent jade, turquoise, brilliant feathers from quetzal birds, and live eagles. The highlands contributed obsidian blades, copper bells, and worked gold. Province by province, commodity by commodity, the empire reduced conquest to an accounting exercise. This was the genius of Aztec imperial strategy. They rarely stationed permanent garrisons in conquered territory. Instead, they left local rulers in place, men who now answered to Tenochtitlan and whose continued authority depended entirely on delivering their quotas on time. These puppet leaders had every incentive to squeeze their own population so that their tribute payments arrived promptly. The Aztecs outsourced oppression to the people who understood it best. But someone had to move all those goods across hundreds of miles of difficult terrain. That task fell to a remarkable and deeply unusual class of people, the Pochteca. These long-distance merchants operated in a world of their own, forming hereditary guilds with their own patron deity, their own courts, and their own ceremonies. They traveled in large caravans, moving at night in some accounts, always downplaying their wealth to avoid arousing envy. On the surface, they were traders carrying luxury goods between distant markets. In practice, they were something considerably more complex. The Pochteca served as the empire's eyes and ears. When a caravan entered a foreign city, its merchants cataloged the local defenses, assessed the political mood, noted which rulers were restless and which were cooperative. They reported back to Tenochtitlan with information that military planners could use. When a city refused to trade or mistreated Aztec merchants, it handed the empire a convenient justification for war. The Pochteca, in other words, sometimes paved the road that the armies would later march down. The goods they carried transformed Tenochtitlan into one of the great market cities of the ancient world. Cacao beans functioned as currency. Quetzal feathers decorated the headdresses of the highest nobles. Cotton arrived by the bale to clothe a population that had grown enormous on the productivity of the Lake Basin's chinampas. Yet the tribute system carried within it the seeds of its own fragility. Not every conquered people accepted their subordination quietly. Rebellions flared across the provinces with regularity, particularly among the Totonac of the Gulf Coast and various Mixtec communities to the south. When a province revolted, the imperial response was swift and deliberately theatrical, designed to punish not merely the rebels, but to terrify every neighboring community watching from a cautious distance. The Aztecs understood that an empire built on extraction rather than loyalty was always one bad harvest, one charismatic rebel, one administrative failure away from unraveling at its edges. These tensions, quiet but persistent, would matter enormously in the decades ahead, when strangers arrived from a direction no Aztec codex had ever mapped. The cracks in the tribute empire were already there, waiting for someone to find them. What made the Aztec empire so difficult to resist? Partly its political machinery, partly its economic reach. But in the end, what gave Tenochtitlan its authority over millions of people was something more visceral: the men it sent into battle. Military training began almost at birth. Boys destined for the commoner schools, the Telpakali, learned the basics of war alongside reading, labor, and religious duty. The sons of nobles attended the Kalmikak, a more rigorous institution that produced priests and military commanders. But both paths led to the same destination. By the time a young man entered his first campaign, he had spent years conditioning his body, studying tactics, and absorbing the deep spiritual conviction that Aztec warriors carried into every engagement. War was not merely strategy. It was sacred obligation. The weapons they carried reflected a civilization that had mastered violence with extraordinary ingenuity. The macuwitl, a flat wooden club edged with razor-sharp obsidian blades, could sever a limb with a single stroke. The atlatl, a throwing board that dramatically extended the range and force of a dart, gave Aztec warriors a ranged capability that many opponents could not match. Shields of woven reeds and wood, covered in painted hide, completed the picture of a fighting force that was both technically sophisticated and visually terrifying. Above the ranks of ordinary soldiers stood the warrior orders. Eagle warriors wore helmets shaped like open bird beaks, their faces peering through the gap. Jaguar warriors dressed in the spotted pelts of the great cats, embodying stealth and ferocity. These were not merely ceremonial distinctions. They marked men who had proven themselves on the battlefield through the act the Aztec military valued above all others: the capture of living enemies. This emphasis on capture, rather than killing, defined Aztec battlefield tactics in ways that puzzled and ultimately disadvantaged them when they met European armies. Killing an enemy quickly was almost beside the point. What mattered was seizing him, dragging him back to Tenochtitlan, and offering his life to the gods on the altars of the great temples. A warrior's rank was counted in captives, not corpses. 3 captives might elevate a commoner to minor nobility. More might bring land, fine cotton clothing, and access to the elite social circles that birth alone could not guarantee. This was the military's most remarkable social function. In a society with rigid class divisions, the battlefield was the one place where a young man born with nothing could transform himself entirely. Proven valor opened doors that ancestry could not. It created a warrior class fiercely motivated by personal ambition as much as patriotic duty. That motivation produced an army of extraordinary effectiveness within Mesoamerica. Against every opponent the Aztecs had faced across more than a century of expansion, it had been more than sufficient. What it had never been tested against, of course, was an enemy who had no interest whatsoever in taking prisoners. When Moctezuma I died in 1469, he left behind an empire at the height of its confidence. What followed was something more complicated. 3 rulers in quick succession, each shaping the empire in vastly different ways, each revealing a different face of Aztec power. Axayacatl, son-in-law to the great Moctezuma, came to power young and hungry for conquest. He moved swiftly. In 1473, just 4 years into his reign, he turned his armies not outward but inward against Tlatelolco, Tenochtitlan's twin city sharing the same island. Tlatelolco's ruler had grown too ambitious, too defiant. Axayacatl crushed him, absorbed the city entirely, and installed a military governor in place of a king. The great marketplace of Tlatelolco, the largest in Mesoamerica, now answered to Tenochtitlan alone. But ambition has a way of outrunning ability. In 1479, Axayacatl marched west against the Tarascan Empire, a formidable rival the Aztecs had long eyed with covetous intent. What he found was catastrophe. The Tarascans fielded a disciplined army of perhaps 80,000 warriors, and they fought to kill rather than to capture. Axayacatl's forces, accustomed to battlefield rituals built around taking prisoners, were overwhelmed and slaughtered. Of the roughly 24,000 Aztec soldiers who crossed into Tarascan territory, fewer than 200 returned. Axayacatl himself barely escaped with his life. It was the single worst military defeat in Aztec history, a wound to imperial prestige that would never fully heal. He died in 1481, and what followed was almost stranger than defeat. Tizoc, the next Tlatoani, presided over a reign so dismal that historians still debate whether his own court eventually murdered him. His military campaigns produced embarrassing results. His coronation war, meant to demonstrate power, yielded barely 40 captives. Tribute flow slowed. Subject peoples sensed weakness. After just 5 years, Tizoc died under suspicious circumstances in 1486, possibly poisoned by nobles unwilling to tolerate further humiliation. Then came Ahuitzotl, and everything changed again. Ahuitzotl was something the empire desperately needed, a conqueror of remorseless energy. He campaigned continuously, driving Aztec armies south through Oaxaca, east to the Gulf Coast, and eventually as far as the Pacific shores and the borders of modern Guatemala. The empire's territory nearly doubled under his reign. Tribute poured into Tenochtitlan in quantities that staggered the imagination. In 1487, he marked his achievements with a ceremony that has echoed through history ever since. The great Templo Mayor in Tenochtitlan was rededicated after years of reconstruction, now towering above the city in its final and most magnificent form. What followed over the course of 4 days was the largest mass sacrifice ever recorded in the Aztec world. Estimates vary widely, but thousands of captives, drawn from years of campaigns, were walked in lines stretching across the causeways and offered to the gods. It was spectacle and theology and political statement all at once, a declaration that the gods of Tenochtitlan had delivered the world into Aztec hands. Yet even Ahuitzotl could not outrun consequence. In the final years of his reign, he commissioned a new aqueduct to solve Tenochtitlan's chronic water shortages. When engineers warned that the flow was too powerful for the existing infrastructure, he reportedly had the man executed for his insolence. The aqueduct burst. Floodwaters poured through the island city, destroying homes, collapsing buildings, and killing residents by the thousands. Ahuitzotl himself suffered a severe head injury during the disaster, and he never fully recovered. He died around 1502. 3 rulers. 3 utterly different legacies. And waiting in the wings, a young man named Moctezuma II, who would inherit the might. The man who stepped forward to claim the throne in 1502 was not the obvious choice. Moctezuma II, the younger, was a priest-warrior of deep intellectual temperament, known as much for his philosophical inclinations as for his battlefield record. The Electoral Council of senior nobles, the ones who held real power over succession, chose him deliberately. They wanted gravity, discipline, and religious authority. They got all 3, and more than they bargained for. His first acts were revealing. Where previous rulers had, at least nominally, permitted talented commoners to rise through military service into positions of influence, Moctezuma II moved swiftly to close that door. He purged the palace of servants and officials appointed under Ahuitzotl, replacing them almost entirely with members of the hereditary nobility. The birth, in his view, was destiny. The reform was sweeping and deliberate, a philosophical statement as much as a political one. The empire would be governed by those the gods had ordained to govern it. This aristocratic rigidity extended to ceremony and protocol. Moctezuma elevated the institution of kingship to something approaching the sacred. Courtiers were forbidden to look directly at him. He dined behind a screen, shielded from ordinary eyes. Hundreds of attendants served his needs with choreographed precision. He changed his garments 4 times daily and reportedly never wore the same clothing twice. Foreign ambassadors who entered his presence did so barefoot, eyes lowered, bearing gifts. The Tlatoani had always carried divine weight. Moctezuma wrapped himself in divinity so completely that the man inside became almost invisible. Yet the man inside was genuinely complex. He was known to walk the city streets in disguise at night, listening to what ordinary people said about him and about the empire. He studied religious texts with the devotion of a scholar. He debated theology with priests and posed questions about the nature of the gods that reportedly unsettled those around him. For all his ceremonial remoteness, curiosity burned in him. His military campaigns continued the expansionist logic of his predecessors, bringing new tribute provinces into the fold and reasserting control over restless territories. But the unconquered neighbors remained stubbornly unconquered. Tlaxcala, the independent republic to the east, fought the Aztecs to a grinding stalemate year after year. The Tarascan Empire to the west, which had shattered Axayacatl's army a generation earlier, remained entirely beyond reach. The Mixtec regions resisted full absorption. These gaps in the imperial map were not merely military frustrations. They were cracks in the ideology of inevitable dominion. And then, beginning around 1509, something stranger crept into the historical record. Aztec chroniclers, writing decades later, described a sequence of omens that reportedly began in these years. A comet blazed across the sky for 40 days. The temple of Huitzilopochtli burst into flames without apparent cause and resisted all efforts to extinguish it. A woman's voice was heard wailing through the streets of Tenochtitlan at night, crying for her children. A strange bird was brought to Moctezuma with a mirror in its head, in which he reportedly saw warriors advancing across a darkened sky. How much of this was genuine memory and how much was later invention, shaped by the catastrophe that followed, is impossible to say with certainty. But the pattern matters. Something in the Aztec world, or at least in Moctezuma's inner life, had begun to shift. The emperor who controlled so much, who had refined imperial power to its sharpest edge, was listening for voices from the other side of history. He would not have to wait much longer to hear them. They came from the east, as prophecy had whispered they might. In February of 1519, Hernan Cortés sailed from Cuba with 11 ships, roughly 500 soldiers, 16 horses, and a handful of small cannons. He carried no mandate from the Spanish crown, and crucially no authorization from Diego Velázquez, the governor of Cuba who had originally commissioned and then canceled the expedition. Cortés had weighed anchor before Velázquez could stop him, an act of breathtaking insubordination that made him technically a fugitive even as he crossed toward a continent he intended to conquer. Whatever happened next, there was no going back to Cuba in defeat. By April, his fleet had anchored off the Gulf Coast near what would become the city of Veracruz. The beach was not empty. Aztec tribute collectors and emissaries arrived almost immediately, dispatched by the regional governor who had already sent urgent word to Tenochtitlan. Moctezuma, 15 days of hard travel inland, was already listening. The emissaries brought artists with them. Moctezuma had ordered detailed pictorial records of everything: the ships, the weapons, the strangers' faces, the extraordinary animals that were horses, creatures that no one in this world had ever seen. The paintings traveled back to the capital in relay runners' pouches, arriving before any European boot had touched the highland soil. What Moctezuma made of those images, no source records with certainty. But his response was telling. He sent back magnificent gifts, including elaborate regalia associated with the feathered serpent deity Quetzalcoatl, whose mythic return from the east had circulated in Aztec religious tradition. Whether Moctezuma genuinely believed Cortés might be a god or a god's emissary, or simply a powerful and dangerous unknown, remains one of history's most debated questions. His behavior suggested paralysis more than clarity. Into this uncertain space stepped one of the most consequential figures of the entire encounter. Her name was Melinson, a Nahuatl-speaking woman from a noble family who had been sold into slavery and ended up among the Maya-speaking peoples of the coast. She already knew the language of the coastal people, and a Spanish priest who had been shipwrecked years earlier knew that same language. Through this chain, Melinson could communicate directly with Cortés, and through her, Cortés could speak to the Aztec world. She learned Spanish with remarkable speed. Within weeks, she was translating in real time. The Spanish called her Doña Marina. History remembers her as La Malinche, the woman whose voice made the conquest possible, who has been called traitor and survivor and everything in between across 5 centuries of argument. With Melinson beside him, Cortés began gathering intelligence at a pace that should have alarmed Tenochtitlan. He learned quickly about the discontented subject peoples, the tribute resentments, the memory of conquest that still burned in places like Zempoala. He began building alliances almost immediately. This was not a man blundering forward. This was a man reading the political landscape with cold precision. Then, in a gesture so dramatic it has echoed through history ever since, Cortés ordered his ships destroyed. The crews stripped what was useful and the hulls were run aground and broken. Some accounts say they were burned. The effect was identical either way. There was now no retreat, no escape, no returning without total victory. Whatever doubts his soldiers carried, they would carry them forward toward Tenochtitlan on foot. The march inland began in the summer of 1519. And in the great city on the lake, Moctezuma deliberated, consulted his priests, received his painted reports, and could not decide. Should he welcome these strangers, appease them with gifts, wait, and watch? Should he have them destroyed at the coast before they gained strength? Every option carried risk. Every council meeting, according to later accounts, ended without resolution. The emperor, who had refined power to its sharpest edge now, found himself reaching for a sword he could not quite grasp. The strangers moved closer every day. The first real test came not from the Aztecs, but from a people who hated them. The Tlaxcalans had resisted Aztec domination for decades, a confederacy of warrior states ringed by the empire but never swallowed by it. When the Spanish column entered their territory in late summer of 1519, the Tlaxcalans did not send gifts. They sent armies. 3 times the Tlaxcalan forces attacked, including one assault involving tens of thousands of warriors. The Spanish firepower, the horses, the steel armor, and the tactical discipline of Cortés held, but barely. Men died. Horses died. The survivors were exhausted and far from any coast. Then something shifted. The Tlaxcalan leadership watched their losses mount and made a calculation. These strangers had survived what should have destroyed them. And the strangers were clearly hostile to Tenochtitlan. The enemy of an enemy was worth considering. By early September, the Tlaxcalans had become allies. The agreement transformed the expedition. What had been a column of roughly 400 surviving Spaniards now marched with a Tlaxcalan force that would eventually swell to tens of thousands. The psychology of the alliance mattered as much as the numbers. Across the highlands, other subject peoples took notice. The unbeatable empire now had enemies walking alongside men with thunder weapons. The calculation spread from one discontented city to the next. Cholula was the next waypoint, a great sacred city of temples and population, nominally an ally of Tenochtitlan. Cortés received intelligence, likely from his Tlaxcalan allies, that the Cholulan leadership was planning an ambush. Whether this was entirely accurate or partially manufactured to justify what followed remains debated by historians. What is certain is what Cortés did with that information. He invited the Cholula nobility and warrior leadership to a gathered meeting. Then he closed the gates. In the enclosed courtyard, Spanish soldiers and their indigenous allies fell on the assembled Cholulans. The killing lasted hours. Estimates of the dead range from a few hundred to several thousand, and the city was looted and partially burned. The survivors scattered with a message that traveled faster than any army, that Cortés was not merely powerful but willing to annihilate without hesitation. The massacre at Cholula was terror as policy. It told every city between the coast and Tenochtitlan exactly what resistance might mean. Some historians argue Cortés genuinely believed in the plot against him. Others read it as cold theater. Either way, the result was the same. The road ahead grew quieter. Moctezuma's response to all of this had been a series of escalating attempts at persuasion. Magnificent gifts had been dispatched to meet the Spanish at various points along their march, gold and featherwork of extraordinary artistry. Alongside the gifts came messages suggesting that the journey was unnecessary, that Cortés should be satisfied with what he had received and turn back. Each time, Cortés accepted the gifts with gracious words and kept walking. Then came the mountain pass. In early November of 1519, the Spanish and their thousands of indigenous allies climbed between the great volcanoes of Popocatépetl and Iztaccíhuatl and looked down into the Valley of Mexico for the first time. Below them lay a landscape of lakes and cities and causeways, and at the center of it all, Tenochtitlan, glittering and vast on its island, larger than any city most of the Spaniards had ever seen in Europe. Bernal Diaz del Castillo, one of the soldiers who stood at that pass, later wrote that some of his companions wondered if they were dreaming. They were not dreaming. And somewhere below, in the palace at the heart of that shining city, an emperor was finally running out of ways to keep them at a distance. November 8th, 1519. The Spanish column and their thousands of Tlaxcalan allies descended from the Highland Pass and moved toward the southern causeway of Tenochtitlan. The road across the water was wide enough for 10 men to walk abreast, stretching nearly 5 miles across the glittering surface of Lake Texcoco. On either side, canoes crowded the shallows, their occupants pressing close to see the strangers who had walked out of the east. Bernal Diaz would later write of towers rising from the water, of the smell of the lake, of the silence that fell over hardened soldiers who had survived months of war and still found themselves unable to speak. Then Moctezuma came out to meet them. He was carried on a litter and dressed in turquoise and gold, his feet never permitted to touch the ground in public. Attendants swept the road before him and held canopies above him. When he descended to face Cortés, the moment froze something in history. Two men at the center of a collision neither fully understood. For generations, this meeting has been told as a story of mistaken identity, of Moctezuma believing Cortés was the returning god Quetzalcoatl, and therefore surrendering everything through theological confusion. The evidence does not support this. The Quetzalcoatl myth was largely constructed after the conquest, shaped by Spanish chroniclers and indigenous writers navigating a world already transformed. Moctezuma was not confused. He was a sophisticated ruler managing an impossible situation, greeting a powerful stranger with the formal language of diplomacy, language that Spanish translators and later historians repeatedly misread as submission. What Moctezuma actually offered was hospitality. The Spanish were given quarters in the palace of Aztec, fed and treated as honored guests. The city itself staggered the Europeans. The great market of Tlatelolco, which Cortés's own letters describe in careful detail, operated with a regularity and scale that dwarfed anything in Spain. Tens of thousands of people traded in a space governed by dedicated judges who settled disputes on the spot. Aqueducts carried fresh water across the lake. Botanical gardens and aviaries filled entire complexes. Tenochtitlan in 1519 held perhaps 200,000 people, making it one of the largest cities on Earth. For Moctezuma, the calculus was pragmatic. The strangers were inside his city, surrounded by his warriors, dependent on his goodwill for every meal. He may have believed time and negotiation would resolve what armies had not. He was wrong about the time. Within days, Cortés made his move. Using a reported incident involving Spanish soldiers on the coast as pretext, he confronted Moctezuma and demanded he relocate to the Spanish quarters, held not as a prisoner in name, but a prisoner in every practical sense. Moctezuma, calculating the odds of open resistance within his own palace, agreed. The emperor of the most powerful state in Mesoamerica was now a guest who could not leave. And Cortés held the door. The fragile equilibrium could not hold. In the spring of 1520, word reached Tenochtitlan that a Spanish fleet had landed on the coast, sent by the governor of Cuba to arrest Cortés for insubordination. Cortés did what only Cortés would do. He left the most volatile city in the world, took the bulk of his forces, and marched to the coast to deal with the threat personally. He left Pedro de Alvarado in command. It was, in retrospect, one of the most consequential decisions of the entire conquest. In May of 1520, the great festival of Toxcatl began in Tenochtitlan, one of the most sacred ceremonies in the Aztec calendar, a celebration honoring Tezcatlipoca with music, dancing, and the participation of the highest Aztec nobility. Thousands gathered in the courtyard of the great temple, adorned in their finest regalia, the feathers and gold of a civilization at worship. Alvarado struck without warning. His soldiers sealed the exits and moved into the crowd with steel. The accounts describe a slaughter lasting perhaps an hour, the screaming of panpipes cut short, the courtyard running red. The exact number killed is disputed, but the effect was not. Tenochtitlan erupted. The Spanish, suddenly vastly outnumbered and surrounded in a city of 200,000 furious people, barricaded themselves in their quarters. Moctezuma, their captive and their only leverage, was pushed before the crowd to call for calm. What happened next belongs to the category of history that will never be fully resolved. The crowd turned on him. Whether he was stoned to death by his own people, enraged at his collaboration, or quietly killed by the Spanish once he had ceased to be useful, no one can say with certainty. Both Spanish and indigenous sources offer versions that serve their own purposes. Moctezuma, the man who had ruled the most powerful empire in the Americas, died in the chaos of a situation he had tried to manage and ultimately could not survive. Cortés returned to find a siege. He negotiated, threatened, maneuvered. None of it worked. On the night of June 30th, 1520, he gave the order to retreat. What followed was catastrophe. The Spanish and their allies attempted to cross the Tlacopan causeway under cover of darkness, carrying a portable bridge and as much of Moctezuma's gold as the men refused to leave behind. The Aztecs were waiting. Warriors in canoes appeared on both sides, and the causeways filled with fighting. Men loaded with gold sank in the dark water. Horses screamed. The portable bridge jammed and could not be moved. Soldiers, trapped between sections of causeway with nowhere to go, drowned or were dragged down by the weight of their own greed. Tlaxcalan allies died by the hundreds. Perhaps half the Spanish force perished that night. Virtually all the treasure was lost. The survivors staggered off the causeway at dawn, bleeding, exhausted, shattered. It was the worst defeat the Spanish would suffer in the entire conquest. Cortés, according to several accounts, sat beneath a great tree at the edge of the city and wept. The Spanish called it La Noche Triste, the night of sorrows. But here is what distinguished Cortés from other men in that moment. He did not weep for long. Even before his wounds were dressed, he was already thinking about what came next, counting his allies, calculating the routes back into the valley, and planning the destruction of a city he had failed to hold. The night of sorrows would become the foundation of a final assault. Tenochtitlan had not seen the last of him. The Aztecs had won. Or so it seemed. With the Spanish driven bleeding from the causeways, the people of Tenochtitlan turned to the urgent business of survival and succession. Moctezuma was dead. A new Tlatoani was needed, someone capable of finishing what the night of sorrows had begun. The choice fell to Cuitlahuac, a man who had counseled resistance from the very beginning, who had urged his people never to let the strangers inside the city in the first place. Here, finally, was a leader whose instincts matched the moment. His reign began with genuine energy. Cuitlahuac moved quickly to repair alliances, fortify the city, and reorganize Aztec warriors for the counterattack everyone knew was coming. He understood Cortés. He knew the Spanish retreat was not a surrender. Across the valley, emissaries went out to neighboring peoples, calling for unity against the invaders. The arguments were persuasive. The Spanish had been humiliated. The moment to finish them was now. But something else had arrived with the retreating soldiers, something invisible, weightless, and incomprehensibly lethal. Smallpox reached Tenochtitlan sometime in the late summer of 1520, carried by a single infected man among the Spanish reinforcements who had landed on the coast months earlier. The Aztecs had no name for it. They had no framework to understand it. They had no immunity whatsoever because the disease had never touched the Americas before. Within weeks, it was moving through the city's dense population like fire through dry grass. The suffering defied description. Entire families collapsed together. Priests, warriors, farmers, nobles, children. The pustules appeared, the fever rose, and in case after case, the body failed. Modern estimates suggest the epidemic killed between 40 and 50% of Tenochtitlan's population in a matter of months. Across Mesoamerica, millions died. Whole communities were erased. The dead could not be buried fast enough. And then, roughly 80 days into his reign, Cuitlahuac died of smallpox. The man chosen to resist the conquest, the most capable military mind the Aztecs had elevated to power at the most critical moment in their history, was killed not by a Spanish sword but by a pathogen his immune system had never encountered. It was not a fair fight. It had never been a fair fight. Power passed to the young Cuauhtémoc, perhaps 25 years old, inheriting a city in the grip of plague, with Cortés already gathering forces in the valley for the final siege. Cuauhtémoc would prove brave beyond measure. But he was leading a people already half destroyed by an enemy no human army could have stopped. This is the truth the documentary record demands. The Aztec Empire was not conquered by Spanish military genius or superior weaponry alone. It was conquered by biology. The invisible conqueror had arrived first, and it had done the most devastating work of all. Cuauhtémoc would now face what remained. Cuauhtémoc inherited a dying city and chose to defend it anyway. In the spring of 1521, Hernán Cortés returned to the Valley of Mexico with a force that dwarfed anything the Spanish had previously assembled in the Americas. He brought roughly 900 Spanish soldiers, 80 horsemen, and more than 100,000 indigenous allies, principally Tlaxcalans, Texcocans, and warriors from dozens of other peoples who had waited generations for a chance to break Aztec power. The Spanish were the tip of the spear. The Allied forces were the spear itself. But Cortés understood something critical. Tenochtitlan was an island city. Canoes and causeways were its lifelines, and any army that tried to storm those causeways directly would be bled dry, just as the Spanish had been on the Night of Sorrows. He would not make that mistake again. His solution was audacious. Months earlier, he had ordered the construction of 13 flat-bottomed warships, brigantines, prefabricated in pieces and carried overland through the mountains by thousands of Tlaxcalan porters. In April of 1521, those pieces were assembled on the shores of Lake Texcoco and launched into the water. Cannon mounted at the bow. Sails raised. The brigantines gave the Spanish something no indigenous power on the lake could match: mobile artillery platforms that could shatter canoe fleets and interdict supply lines from the water itself. The siege began in late May. Cortés divided his forces across 3 causeways simultaneously, pressing inward from multiple directions while the brigantines patrolled the lake. One by one, the aqueducts feeding fresh water into the city were severed, Food shipments stopped. The city of perhaps 200,000 people, already ravaged by smallpox, began to starve. What followed was not a swift conquest. It was 75 days of some of the most brutal urban combat the Western Hemisphere had ever witnessed. Cuauhtémoc refused to break. His warriors fought with extraordinary ferocity, retreating block by block, forcing the Spanish and their allies to pay for every street in blood. The Aztecs developed countermeasures against the brigantines, staking hidden poles beneath the shallow lake water to hold the ships' hulls. When Spanish forces advanced during the day and tore down buildings to deny cover to defenders, Aztec warriors crept back at night and rebuilt the barricades before dawn. Every canal became a kill zone. Every rooftop a fighting position. At several points, the defenders actually reversed the Spanish advance. In late June, Aztec warriors ambushed a Spanish column, captured dozens of soldiers, and sacrificed them atop the Great Temple while their comrades watched helplessly from a distance. It was a deliberate act of psychological warfare, and it worked. Spanish morale briefly collapsed. But the arithmetic of the siege was unforgiving. The city was being strangled. Disease, starvation, and relentless fighting ground the defenders down week by week. The streets filled with the dead. Fresh water was gone. By August, survivors were drinking from puddles and eating bark. On August the 13th, 1521, Cuauhtémoc attempted to escape across the lake by canoe. A brigantine intercepted him. He was brought before Cortés, reportedly placing his hand on the conquistador's dagger and asking to be killed rather than witness further suffering. Cortés refused. The last Tlatoani of the Aztec Empire was taken prisoner, and Tenochtitlan fell silent. The greatest city in the Americas had been reduced to rubble, its temples smashed, its canals choked with debris and the unburied dead. A civilization that had taken centuries to build lay in ruins after 75 days. What Cortés intended to build on those ruins would reshape an entire continent. Tenochtitlan did not simply disappear beneath the boots of the conquistadors. It was buried deliberately. Cortés ordered the ruins leveled and a European city constructed directly on top. The stones of Aztec temples were pried apart and used as foundation material for Spanish cathedrals. The Metropolitan Cathedral of Mexico City, still standing today in the heart of the capital, rests on the bones of the sacred precinct. The conquerors understood the symbolic power of that choice. If you worship where they worshipped, you forget what they worshipped. Cuauhtémoc survived his capture for 4 years. In 1525, Cortés had him tortured, his feet burned in oil, in an attempt to extract information about hidden Aztec gold. He reportedly endured it without confession. Shortly afterward, Cortés had him hanged on a pretext during an expedition to Honduras. The last emperor died not in battle, but by the deliberate hand of the man who claimed to have liberated his people. The colonial project that followed was systematic. Spanish authorities banned Aztec religious practices, burned codices, and suppressed indigenous institutions across New Spain. Yet erasure proved harder than conquest. Nahuatl, the Aztec language, refused to die. Over 1 million people still speak it across Mexico today. Missionaries who hoped to convert indigenous populations actually helped preserve Aztec knowledge by recording it. Figures like Friar Bernardino de Sahagún spent decades interviewing Aztec elders, compiling the 12-volume Florentine Codex, a staggering encyclopedic record of Aztec life, religion, history, and medicine. The very people attempting to replace the culture inadvertently ensured fragments of it survived. Then came 1978. Workers laying electrical cables beneath downtown Mexico City struck something unexpected at a depth of about 2 meters. What they uncovered was a massive carved stone disc, over 3 meters wide, depicting the dismembered body of Quetzalcoatl, the moon goddess of Aztec mythology. The discovery triggered an excavation project that has continued for decades. The Templo Mayor complex, the very heart of Tenochtitlan, had been sitting beneath a busy city block the entire time. Artifacts numbering in the tens of thousands have since been recovered, rewriting assumptions about Aztec ritual, economy, and cosmology. The Aztec presence in modern Mexico is not purely archaeological. It is living. The Mexican flag carries the eagle perched on a cactus devouring a serpent, the founding vision that led the wandering Mexica to build their city on an island lake centuries ago. Corn, chocolate, tomatoes, chili peppers, avocado, foods that define global cuisine today, came from the agricultural traditions the Aztecs refined and practiced. Even the name Mexico derives from Mexica. What the conquerors called barbarism, history has gradually re-examined. The Aztec Empire was a civilization of extraordinary complexity, ambition, and sophistication, one that built a metropolis larger than any in contemporary Europe and sustained millions of people through ingenuity and organization. The story of the Aztecs did not end in 1521. In many ways, it never ended at all. The Mexica rose from nothing to build a world, and their legacy endures in every tortilla, every map, and every heartbeat of modern Mexico. Subscribe for more histories the conquerors tried to erase.